while the Protestant Reformation was occurring in Europe, Europe was also exploring the New World. This would have just as big of an impact on Europe as the Reformation would. So today we're going to look at all the countries and the different explorers that went on voyages of exploration, discovery, and colonization. So if you would like to follow along, this is Lecture 4, European Voyages of Exploration, Discovery, and Colonization. And before I start, I want to recommend some books to you if you like studying explorers. The first one is called Pathfinders, A Global History of Exploration by Felipe Fernandez Armesto. This is what the cover looks like. The next two are by a guy named Samuel Eliot Morison. He was a naval officer in World War II. He wrote like a 15-volume history of the Navy in World War II. So he's got a lot of naval experience. The first one is called The Great Explorers, and it just covers all the famous explorers from Europe. And then the second one is his biography of Christopher Columbus. It's called Admiral of the Ocean Sea. It won the Pulitzer Prize. He's a pretty good writer, and he's got a lot of good information. So if you kind of like explorers, I would check out these guys. Okay, so we'll get started. If you look at the map on slide 2, it kind of shows you where the European countries colonized in the New World. Spain colonized Mexico and South America. France tended to colonize around Canada. England kind of stuck to the Atlantic seaboard of the present-day United States. The Portuguese colonized Brazil. And there's really 3 reasons that Europe undertook voyages of exploration: God, gold, and glory. The church wants to spread Christianity. There's also a Catholic-Protestant rivalry, so they want to spread their version of Christianity. Gold, Europe wants to get rich through trade with the East, and also glory. You know, countries want glory for themselves. Individuals want glory for themselves. So we'll kind of look at these different reasons. Now, why did Europe succeed in conquering the New World? Well, there's a number of reasons. Internal divisions of the Indians. When the Europeans got to North and South America, the Indians had often been fighting amongst themselves, and that made it easy to ally with one Indian group against another. The Europeans had superior technology. They had guns, sailing ship, and horses. They also had war dogs, and they have disease on their side. The Indian population was vastly reduced just because of this disease. And if you think about it, Europe had experienced the Black Plague, the Black Death, in the 14th century. Well, now they're immune to those diseases, but the Indians in North and South America are not. So the Indians in the New World basically lived through what the Europeans had to live through 150 years earlier. And another reason is the conquerors, the European conquerors, are very bold. We'll look at some of the conquistadors, Cortez and Pizarro, and we'll see how their bold moves ended up allowing them to be victorious. Now, if you look at slide 4, you can kind of see how Europe is on the fringe of the Afro-Eurasian trade routes. Most of the wealth is located in the east. Europe is not wealthy at this time. Europe is on the edge, on the periphery. So what attracts Europe to the east? Well, there's the riches of Asia. There's spices, silks, and other riches. There was a supposedly Christian king named Prester John. He was a potential ally against the Muslim nations of the east. Remember, Europeans in the 1400s still remember the Crusades. That legacy is still around, so there's still this battle going on between Christianity and Islam. And curiosity, you know, people are curious about what's beyond. Marco Polo was a European. He traveled to China in the 13th century, and he brought back a lot of riches. He brought back spices, dyes, rugs, and silks. But he also brought back a lot of crazy stories about the East. He got the nickname Il Million, the millions, for basically all the crazy stories he told. And his stories kind of shook the European establishment. You know, he said there's places, you know, in China where they have better technology than us. They're richer. Their palaces are larger. So a lot of people were curious about the East. Supposedly on his deathbed, a lot of people thought Marco Polo told tall tales. So they said, hey, you're about to die. Why don't you come clean and tell us about those stories? You made a lot of them up, right? and supposedly some of his last words were, "I didn't tell you half of what I saw." So a lot of people were inspired by Polo. Christopher Columbus kept his book that told of his travels with him. There was another book, The Travels of Sir John Mandeville. It supposedly told of travels to the east. You know, he talked about the Fountain of Youth, cannibals, people with the head of dogs, wolves that were the size of oxen, uh, cyclops, ants that are as big as dogs and they dig for gold. A lot of stories, but it turns out these are all fake. There was never anybody named Sir John Mandeville that made these travels, but Europeans read these stories and they're really curious. Um, Now, Europe is coming out of the Black Death, which probably killed a third to a half of Europe. You know, 25 million dead, up to 200 million dead. We don't really know, but those are the numbers. But as population grows in the 14 and 1500s, you start to have more of a demand for things like spices to make your food less bland. The way you get to the east is land routes. Now, these are dangerous for a number of reasons. Geographically speaking, you have mountains, rivers, and deserts. There's bandits that will attack you on your way home to steal your merchandise. You have to pass through the territories of kings, and they demand tribute or taxes in return for safe passage. So land routes are expensive. You have to pay for protection. You have to pay taxes of the kings you pass through. You sometimes pay off bandits, um, and when you pay for all that protection and all that travel time, when you come back to Europe and sell the spices or the dyes or the rugs, you really have to bump up your prices, right? So this just makes everything more expensive. So the problem is that land routes are slow, dangerous, and expensive. So what is the solution? An all-water route to the east. You could bypass the middlemen, and the Italian merchants like the Genoese and the Venetians, those are the middlemen. They get the stuff and then they sell it to Spain, Portugal, England, the Holy Roman Empire, France, you know, Eastern Europe, and it just jacks up the prices. So you could bypass the middlemen. Um, and you know, ships are faster than traveling overland. They don't pass through any king's territory. You don't have to pay a tax for traveling through the ocean. There's no bandits you have to worry about, so you don't need to worry about protection. So what enabled water routes to displace land routes? Well, you got technological advances, political changes, and religious events. A lot of technological advances, and I'll kind of zero in on some of these here in a minute. But you get new inventions that make ships able to sail further. You get new tools or instruments like the astrolabe, astronomical tables, plotting boards. You get the stern rudder post. You get more accurate maps. You get the lateen sail. You have better hulls that allow bigger ships to be built. Now, the old ship that was dominant in the Middle Ages is the galley. So if you look at slide 16, I've got some pictures of a galley. The picture on the far right is a galley. A galley is long and narrow. It can't go into storms or haul a lot of cargo because it'll get snapped in half. It's really good for the Mediterranean because the Mediterranean has calm weather, but it's not good for weathering storms in the Atlantic. Like I said, it can't carry much cargo. It's powered by square sails that can only go the direction the wind takes you. And it has human oarsmen, so it's human powered and wind powered. Now, the new ship that allows exploration is the caravel. Um, it's short and fat, so that means it's good in storms. It has a deep hull, so it can carry a lot of cargo. It has lateen sails, which are triangular sails that you angle so that you can sail into the wind. Galleys cannot sail against the wind, but lateen sails on the caravel, they can sail against the wind, and they're very maneuverable. And if you want to click on the YouTube clip, it shows you kind of how galleys used to work. It's kind of interesting. Another kind of version of a caravel is a carrack. This is a huge caravel. It's almost like a castle on the ocean. It has huge towers that have gunmen up there with muskets or cannon. If you want to click on the astrolabe link to YouTube, that's a TED Talk where they kind of talk about how they work. It's pretty interesting. Political changes. Monarchs start to consolidate their possessions into large dynastic states. You get the unification of lands, which allows for an increasable tax base. which gives you more funding for exploring the New World. If you look at slide 19, you can kind of see a map. Look at Europe in the 1300s. It's very decentralized, a lot of different kingdoms, but by the 1500s, you start to see the modern states of Europe. So, before the King of Spain had a lot of there was no King of Spain, there was a lot of different lands in what is modern day Spain. By the 1500s, there's one monarch of Spain, so you can tax that whole area and send out people. And we've got the Protestant Reformation that just spurs people to spread Protestantism or Catholicism. So, like during the Cold War, how the United States and the Soviet Union had a space race, you kind of had like a religious race in the 14 and 1500s to get to the New World first. Okay, so Portugal actually kickstarts this exploration. If you look at the little map on slide 21, Portugal can't really get to the rest of Europe. All those spices that come to Italy and then go to the Holy Roman Empire, then France, then Spain, then Portugal, those prices get jacked up. So Portugal decides to go to the Atlantic. Prince Henry the Navigator is kind of the main person here. He supports the study of ships, geography, winds and currents, and navigation. He sponsored 15 expeditions over a decade in the 1420s and 30s. The Portuguese are motivated by military glory, religion. They want to locate Prester John and ally with him. And they also want slaves, gold, and the trade routes of Africa to come under their fall. They kind of start sailing down the coast of Africa. So they're going to go around Africa to get to India. That's their route. There's kind of two guys I want you to know. Bartholomew Diaz, he rounds the southern tip of Africa. He went on an expedition in 1487. There's a big storm as he's going around the tip of Africa. He gets around it and ends up, he doesn't make it to India, but he realizes you can round Africa. They call this the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa. He's planning a second venture, but that doesn't get going. The main guy for the Portuguese is Vasco da Gama. He's the first successful sailor to go from Portugal to India via the east through the ocean. He didn't hug the coast. You can see on the map he really swung out into the Atlantic. He goes around Africa and he gets to India. They didn't see land for 93 days. The sailors started to get scurvy, which is a disease, a vitamin C deficiency. They start to lose their teeth, their gums get really kind of disgusting, and their teeth start to fall out. A lot of them thought that it just wasn't natural to be off of the land for so long, and that kind of makes sense to the early modern era. Humans are supposed to stay on land. They're not fishes. They shouldn't be on water that long. But what Da Gama did is he provided a way for Portugal to bypass all the European nations, and they went directly to the east. The entire voyage took 2 years and covered 24,000 miles, but the pepper and cinnamon he brought back paid for the trip 90 or 60 times over. Another famous Portuguese was Pedro Cabral. He discovered Brazil. He was not trying to discover Brazil. He just sailed too far out into the Atlantic while he was going to the east, and he bumped into Brazil. If you look at slide 28, you can see the Portuguese Empire. The Portuguese built the first huge empire overseas, and they mostly focused in the east, in the Indian Ocean, Africa, kind of in modern-day Indonesia. They do colonize Brazil, but you can see the Portuguese Empire mainly focuses on the east. Now, pretty soon, Spain is going to bypass Portugal. And the first great person that we kind of look at is Christopher Columbus. Not much is known about his early life. He was shipwrecked once. He was on a Genoese ship that was sunk by a French ship, and supposedly he floated 6 miles in the water off the coast of Portugal before he made it home, or made it to Lisbon, and then him and his brother stay there. Basically, Columbus says, I want to get to the Indies, to India, China, but I want to sail west, way out into the Atlantic Ocean, and eventually come around to the other side. Now, people didn't think the world was flat back then. They knew it was round, but they didn't know how big the world was. Columbus actually thought it wouldn't take very long to sail westward and get to the Indies. So he underestimated the voyage, how long it would be. he wasn't the first one to try this. The Vivaldi brothers did this in the 13th century. They sailed out into the Atlantic hoping to make it to the Indies, and they were never heard from again. So this is a risky venture. Basically, Columbus spent a lot of the 1480s and early 1490s traveling to all the monarchs in Europe, or most of them, and asking for backing for his expedition. He went to Portugal, Spain, England, France. Uh, the Spanish started something called the Talavera Commission, basically like, let's look into see if Columbus's venture is possible. Um, so he finally goes back to Spain. He gets rejected, but in 1492, he comes back and they say, yes, we will fund your venture. A couple reasons. Spain had been fighting the Muslims for 700 years. Islam spread into Spain in the 8th century, and basically the Christians and the Muslims have been fighting for 700 years. In 1492, Spain finished the Reconquista. That's the name for when they were fighting the Muslims. And the last Muslims are kicked out of Spain. Granada is the last Muslim stronghold to fall. So Spain had been dealing with this huge issue, and now they've solved that issue from their perspective. So now they can focus on helping Columbus. And the finance minister tells Isabella, if you maybe skip 1 week of partying, maybe you could pay for his venture. So they end up telling Columbus they'll sponsor him. Um, Columbus calls his expedition the Enterprise of the Indies, and he wants a lot of stuff. He wants to be called Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He wants to be made Viceroy and Governor of anywhere he discovers, and he wants 10% of all the trade that goes on, which would make him very rich. So in August 1492, he sets out on 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. It's a very long voyage. If you look at slide 35, you can see Columbus thought China and Japan were really close to Europe, but they're actually a lot farther away, so he underestimated the distance, like I said. Some of his men talk about mutiny because they've been out to sea so long. But after 31 days, when this talk of mutiny breaks out, they finally spot land. They go ashore October 12th, 1492. Columbus claims the land for Spain. He names the island San Salvador, which means Holy Savior. Columbus was a very religious person. He meets some Indians. He describes them as friendly, naked, and curious. He gives them gifts. He kidnaps or enslaves a couple of them so that they can be guides to him traveling around the Caribbean. He has his first contact with tobacco. He sees some Indians smoking it through a pipe in their noses. That's how the Indians smoked it. He visits different Indian villages. While they're exploring, the Santa Maria runs aground on Christmas Day, 1493. 1492. They end up building a settlement there out of the ship. Columbus leaves behind about 40 people. He goes back to Europe, and he ends up telling Europe of what he did. The voyage home was really rough. It was a lot rougher than the voyage there. He has some incidents that occur on the way home, but he finally gets home in March of 1493. He meets with the monarch of Portugal, King John. King John turned him down, so it's kind of an awkward meeting. But he finally meets with Ferdinand and Isabella. He brings back some Indian slaves. He brings back some gold, not a lot, and he kind of shows off what he's found. There's kind of this interesting story. It's the egg story. Columbus was pretty famous, and he goes to dinner parties. People want to have him come eat with them, and nobody believed that he could do this before he did it. So at the dinner, he'll be like, I want to see if anyone can balance this egg on its top, and everyone like takes the egg and tries to balance it, and no one can do it. So what he does is he takes the egg and he smashes it, and then he balances it, and he's like, there, I balanced it. And some people are like, wait, that's cheating. But then Columbus is like, you just didn't know how to do it first. I figured it out, so now you're jealous of me. So kind of a metaphor of his life, I guess. Columbus makes 3 more voyages. I won't go into them, but if you read that book, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, it talks about every single voyage. It's really interesting. He ends up getting taken home as a prisoner on his 3rd voyage. He gets taken back to Spain in chains. So he has a lot of ups and downs. He died thinking he had always found the Indies of the East. He never knew he discovered a new world. Now, America does not get named after uh, Columbus. You know, we have North and South America, not North and South Columbus. The reason this is there was a Florentine navigator named Amerigo Vespucci, and he supposedly had gone to the New World, and he wrote a letter, or somebody else wrote a letter about him called Mundus Novus. That's Latin for New World. And in this letter, supposedly written by Vespucci, he says, "We may rightly call this a new world." Now, there's a German map maker named Martin Waldseemüller, and he says, "I'm going to put this North and South America on a map. What should I call it?" Well, he sees the Mundus Novus letter and he says, "I'll call it America after Amerigo Vespucci." If you look at slide 52, there's something called the Columbian Exchange. When Columbus comes to the New World, he brings a lot of things. He brings, and the rest of the Spanish, you know, this isn't just Columbus, but they bring new animals, new foods, new diseases, new weapons, new culture, new ideas, ways of thinking, and they take back to Europe new diseases, new foods, new culture, all kinds of stuff. So basically, the Columbian Exchange is just the transfer of people, food, ideas, diseases, etc., between the New World and the Old World. So if you look at slide 53, Portugal and Spain basically divide up their colonies. They draw a line down the middle of the Atlantic. It's called the Treaty of Tordesillas. It's in 1494. But basically, Portugal gets everything to the east, so Africa, the Indian Ocean, modern-day Indonesia, and Spain gets everything to the west, North and South America. All right, I'm going to start talking about some more explorers. I'm going to skip over a lot of these because there's just too many people to talk about, but I'm going to talk about Magellan and Cortez and Pizarro, and some of the other ones I'll skip over. You can look at them on the slides and kind of see where they explored, but I want to focus on these people. So Ferdinand Magellan, he's actually a Portuguese sailor. He had fought battles as a Portuguese sailor, but he has a falling out with the King of Portugal, and he shifts his loyalty to Spain. And because he has a lot of experience, he takes his insider knowledge of what makes Portugal so successful, and he takes it to Spain. He's sent by Charles V, the guy that had overseen the Diet of Worms. Charles V sends him on a voyage to sail around the world. They wanted to get to the riches of the Indies, and they wanted to prove that it was on their side of the line of the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Treaty of Tordesillas did not extend around the globe, it was just down the Atlantic Ocean. So technically, Spain could travel west and go through the Pacific and come around and still be on their side of the line. It's kind of a gray area. So Magellan sets out in 1519. He has 5 ships and 270 men. One of the people on the ship keeps a diary of the journey. What ends up happening is they sail around the world. They face mutinies and storms. There's a couple times Magellan has to either execute people or put them on an island and sail off, just leaving them to die because of mutinies. They come around the tip of South America. There's a huge storm. And they get out into the Pacific Ocean, and they name it the Peaceful Ocean, the Pacificus. That means peaceful in Latin. The southern tip of South America is named the Straits of Magellan after him. They sail 99 days in the Pacific. They reach Guam and the Philippines. Magellan gets involved in battles with the local Indians. He takes sides. Remember, the Indians fight the Indians, so he picks a side, and he actually gets killed in a battle in the Philippines. About 40 Spanish sailors, soldiers, went and fought thousands and thousands of Indians, and they got killed. Now, not everyone fought. There were still some ships, and some of the ships got shipwrecked. Some of them sailed back home, but Magellan dies. So one ship returns to Spain in 1522, led by Juan Sebastian del Cano. So they started with 5 ships and 270 men. They come home with 1 ship and 22 men. So almost a total loss. It took 3 years, 60,000 miles, but they do make a profit. Like I said, I'm going to skip over a lot of these guys just because I want you can kind of look at them. It would take too long. but Vasco Nunez de Balboa, Juan Ponce de Leon, Panfilo de Narvaez, Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, Hernando de Soto, Francisco de Coronado, Juan de Onate. So a lot of explorers. But there's a new group I want to talk about. So I'm on slide 67. These are the conquistadors. That's Spanish for conquerors. These guys don't explore, they conquer. And there's three mighty Indian civilizations in the New World that are going to get conquered. The Aztecs, the Mayas, and the Incas. We'll look at the Aztec and the Incas. And if you look at slide 68, if you want to learn more, these Indian civilizations are fascinating. I mean, they had stuff that was better than what Europeans had. Some of their cities were better, their roads were better. So if you want to read about or watch something on the Aztecs, the Mayas, or the Incas, I would suggest starting with these. I just accidentally clicked on a link, so it's going to open here. I'll have to get out of it. Okay. All right, so let's start with the Aztecs. They were a mighty empire located in what is now Mexico. They're at the height of their power when Spain shows up. They had settled in the middle of Lake Texcoco in 1325. There was a divine prophecy for the Aztecs where an eagle. Oh, sorry. My link opened up.
Maybe we finished it.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so where was I? Yeah, the divine prophecy said that an eagle was going to eat a snake on some type of cactus or flower plant, and supposedly they saw this, and that's where they built Tenochtitlan, which is their capital. So it's on Lake Texcoco. Montezuma, sometimes called Moctezuma, he was the ruler. The capital city was Tenochtitlan. It was larger than any European city, maybe 500,000 people. It was fed by islands in Lake Texcoco. It was watered by aqueducts. It was connected to the mainland by three big causeways. So the engineering feats of the Aztecs was just as good as the Romans. Now, the Aztecs are a pretty brutal Indian tribe. They sacrificed humans to the gods. Their religion teaches that the gods made the world through sacrificing their own blood or using their own blood. And basically, the Aztecs believed to keep the world going, we have to sacrifice human blood to the gods every year. Now, they don't sacrifice their own Indians. They attack neighboring Indian tribes and take them as prisoners and then sacrifice them. They would cut their hearts out, cut them open, throw them down the temple stairs. Pretty brutal stuff. There's some evidence that in 1487, the Aztecs may have had a sacrifice where 4,000 on the low end to 80,000 people on the high end were killed as human sacrifices in 4 days. So the Aztecs are pretty hated by the other tribes. The Aztec military is very organized. You've got jaguar and eagle warriors. You've got archers, slingers. The warriors wear bright feathers. They have this kind of club slash sword called a maquahital. It's a wood club with obsidian, razor sharp obsidian rocks put in there. They got wooden shields. They got an atlatl, which is a dart thrower. I've got some YouTube videos you can click on if you would like to watch people use these weapons or kind of show you how they work. But Hernando Cortez is the Spanish conquistador that's going to conquer the Aztecs. Spain was headquartered in Cuba, the New Spain that kind of oversaw the colonies. In 1518, the governor of New Spain picks Cortez to invade Mexico and conquer it. He lands in 1519. The conquistadors have modern European weapons. They've got steel swords, helmets, body armor. They got crossbowmen, arquebusers, light cannon, war horses, war dogs. And they end up using these things to conquer. What ends up happening is Cortez marches to Tenochtitlan. He defeats Indians on the way and allies with them, and then he ends up taking Montezuma captive. Montezuma invites him into the city. He gets taken captive. Cortez has to go back to the coast and fight some Spanish who come to arrest him. He had been in a lot of trouble. He defeats the Spanish, gets them to go with him. They go back and they fight a huge battle in Tenochtitlan. Montezuma is killed. Cuauhtémoc is the new emperor, the new Aztec emperor. The Spanish escape on the night of July 1st, 1520. They escaped Tenochtitlan. This is called La Noche Triste, the sad night. About half of the Spanish conquistadors are killed. Some of them drown trying to escape. Some of them are captured and offered as human sacrifices. Um, Cortez retreats. He gathers more allies. He builds a navy to kind of blockade Tenochtitlan, and he ends up in the siege of Tenochtitlan, defeating the Aztecs. So in August 1521, Tenochtitlan falls. They kill the last Aztec emperor. So why did the Spanish conquistadors, why was Cortez so successful? Well, I've got basically 5 reasons. Military technology, naval technology, disease. A lot of the Aztecs were wiped out by disease. The Aztec oppression helped the conquistadors because they got a lot of Indians on their own side. And then Cortez's boldness. You know, if Tenochtitlan did have 500,000 people, Cortez marched in there with a few hundred. I don't care how powerful you are. 500,000 versus 300 are not good odds. Now, the other Indian place I want to look at is the Incas. They're in South America. They had a huge empire, really impressive engineering. They had storehouses built on the side of mountains. They have thousands of miles of roads. They have runners to carry messages throughout their empire, so you could communicate pretty quickly in the Inca Empire. Their ruler is Atahualpa, and one of the things that is going on is there's a civil war happening in the Inca Empire when Francisco Pizarro shows up. So Francisco Pizarro shows up, and right as the civil war is going on, he shows up with less than 200 men. At the Battle of Cajamarca, he meets Atahualpa, and what happened is Atahualpa has an army of tens of thousands. Atahualpa takes 7,000 of his men, and they go meet Pizarro, who has less than 200. Pizarro's 200 men slaughter the 7,000 Incas. They've got their guns and their cannons, and they've got their war horses. So they end up killing them, and they take Atahualpa prisoner. Atahualpa says he'll give the conquistadors gold if they let him go. They promise to let him go. They get the gold, and then they kill him. Pizarro was later killed he had killed someone, so that person's son assassinated Pizarro a few years later. If you look at slide 92, you can see there's a map of New Spain, pretty big. How did Spain govern the New World? Well, they had 4 viceroyalties: New Spain, Peru, New Granada, and La Plata. They would have a viceroy that was basically an imperial governor, and they would also have an audiencia. It was 12 to 15 judges that kind of gave advice to the viceroy. New Spain grows very slowly. By the 1570s, there's only about 160,000 Spanish people who have come there. There's different reasons for the slow growth, but one of the reasons, or the main reason, is this view of mercantilism. Now, what is mercantilism? Mercantilism is the belief that there's a limited amount of wealth in the world, and wealth is either gold, silver, or other precious metals, and a nation must get as much gold and silver as possible. So basically, Spain wanted to mine the New World and bring as much of that wealth to Europe. They weren't interested in going and settling there and starting a new country necessarily. They wanted the wealth. And mercantilism, I think of it as like a pie. There's only so many pieces. So if you're Britain and you want more gold, you have to take a piece of the pie from someone else. So you take it from Spain and France, let's say. So the important thing about mercantilism, it's a zero-sum game. Spain brings back this gold and silver and huge treasure fleets. Spain also sets up something called the encomienda system. It's pretty harsh. Basically, it grants the conquerors rights to employ the Indians as laborers. They're really slaves. The Spanish are supposed to feed and take care and house the Indians, but the Indians die because they're not used to this forced labor. Some Spanish people spoke out against this. And what ends up happening is you start to have slavery develop in the New World. Now, slavery had always existed in the New World. The Indians practiced slavery, but slavery becomes a racial thing starting in the 14 and 1500s. Slavery had existed in the Middle Ages, but it wasn't based on race. Europe used to have white slaves from the Eastern Mediterranean, but in 1453, the Muslim Ottoman Empire conquers Constantinople. So basically, the traditional source of slaves for Europe is cut off. And this is about the same time that the Europeans are discovering Africa, the Portuguese especially. So they start taking, instead of European slaves, they start getting African slaves. In 1444, the first African slaves come to Lisbon. Slave traders normally just had coastal raids where they would capture slaves, but later on they start working with African warlords or kings to basically they'll round up the Africans on their own and then they'll sell them to the Europeans. Slavery eventually becomes intertwined with sugar. And if you look at slide 103, you can see how most of the slaves went to South America, some and the Caribbean. Some of them came to North America as well. Now, sugar is originally a luxury item, but as the population in Europe increases, demand grows. It's a very labor-intensive crop. You have to plant the seed stems by hand. You have to harvest it quickly to avoid spoiling. There's a continuous growing season. New technology allowed the sugar to be processed quicker, but the only way you can take advantage of this increase in production based on machines is to also have the labor there to keep up. So demand and labor means a demand for more slaves. In 1518, Charles I of Spain, which is also Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, he authorizes traders to bring African slaves to the New World. So the Portuguese brought the first slaves to Brazil around 1550. The Dutch West India Company, the British Royal African Company start getting involved in the slave trade. The passage from Africa to the New World was called the Atlantic Passage. There were high death rates for the slaves, the Africans. You had dysentery, other diseases, poor food, cramped spaces. They would cramp the slaves in the bottoms of ships and just pack them in there to get as many to the New World as possible. There's no sanitation down there. From about 1500 to 1800, about 10 million Africans are taken into slavery in the New World. The 17th century would be the peak of slavery. So there's also the slavery's going on. There's also a lot of silver that's leaving the New World to the Old World. I'm not as concerned about that or the statistics, but just know that a lot of wealth is leaving the New World and going to Spain and Europe. So that's exploration. I got one more lecture on exploration, and that'll be the end of Module 1.